All right, welcome back to WCHS, ladies and gentlemen. When you leave here today, I want you to understand the last part of the A1 assessment, and that is the relationship paragraph. On the rubric, you'll notice that there's a separate category for the relationship, and it is a mark out of 6. So now that we've discussed interpretation of each source, now we're going to do a second step, a second part of the assignment, which is now relating them. So in your notebook, can I get you to create some notes on A1, and then next to that put relationship paragraph. So what typically happens with a set of 3 sources is students will interpret each one and then do a final relationship paragraph. So in the end, you will end up with 4 paragraphs. One paragraph where you interpret source 1, a second paragraph where you interpret source 2, a third paragraph where you interpret source 3, and then this final relationship paragraph. Relationship paragraph, again, is marked out as 6 of the total 20 marks, so that's 30% of the assignment. And in the 1 hour window that the assignment is meant to take, the relationship paragraph should take about 15 minutes. So 15 minutes per source, and then a final 15 minutes for the relationship. This is meant to be a 1 hour activity. In the beginning here, you'll probably be getting closer to 2 hours as you become more skillful and predictive of the process. So let's jump in. In order to teach this, we're going to look back at the set that we've been dealing with and use that as some kind of skeleton to build this around. So one fear is that students sometimes miss this first step. And when they miss it, they may end up condemning themselves to 40%. On the assignment, it specifically says for you to identify and explore a relationship or relationships that all 3 sources have in common. So we want to begin with that. So I would recommend that you begin your relationship paragraph with a sentence similar to this. I'm just going to be referring to the sideboard there. So step number 1, announce a common question that each one of the sources is answering. So now that we've interpreted the sources separately, I want you to look at the 3 as a set and say, if they are a set, each one communicating an answer to a question, what's that question that holds them together as a set? Taken as a set, what is that question that holds them together? So you might begin your relationship paragraph with a sentence like, taken as a set, comma, each of these sources presents a perspective in response to the common. Now you could use the word theme or the common question, and then tell me what that common question is. So for every A1 that you do in grade 10, for every A1 that you do in grade 11, for every A1 that you do in grade 12, including the diploma, you could have a sentence to begin your relationship paragraph similar to this. And then you'll ensure that you don't miss this step. So I don't want you to be sitting paralyzed in your desk wondering, how do I get started with this paragraph? This is how you get started. Taken as a set, each of the sources presents a perspective in response to the common question, comma, and then quotation marks. To what extent? Something. Now this is where you might have to pause and go back and look at the 3 sources and say, what is that common question that they're all answering? Now with regards to the 3 sources that we were looking at, I went back in the sources and I tried to find some kind of common detail, some common word that they're all wrestling with, some kind of common theme that they're wrestling with, and see if there's something that comes up in each one. So source 1 talked about globalization, so the story goes, has swept like a flood tide through the world's diverse cultures. Now, so let's say in theory I'm thinking, okay, do all of them deal with a flood? I look at the second one, there's no reference to a flood. I look at the third one, there's no reference to a flood. So this common thematic question isn't to what extent is globalization a flood? Only one talks about it metaphorically as a flood. So I have to pick some kind of detail, some nuance that holds them together as a set. Globalization, so the story goes, has swept like a flood tide through the world's diverse cultures, destroying stable localities, displacing peoples, bringing a market-driven, branded homogenization of cultural experience. Thus, and here I am on camera going to mispronounce the word, obliterating the differences between locality-defined cultures which had constituted our identities. So it doesn't use the word homogenization, but it's talking about that theme, right? The second one is that culture clash cartoon, also looking at that theme. The third one says, I think for globalization to truly work, everyone must be open to it and compromise. So being that the third one announces that question, if globalization is going to work, the first one's saying maybe it's not working, depending upon whether you read sarcasm in it. And the second one is saying that because of the aggressive nature of the Americans, it's not working. So a simple question might be to say, to what extent does globalization work? You know, this person is saying it's not working because the nature of Americans is to be confrontational. This person is using sarcasm to say it does work, but maybe we're too focused on the negative side. This person is saying it could work if we compromise. So a simple question might be saying, to what extent does globalization work? But then you might be looking at it and saying, well, is it that each one is also saying, to what extent does globalization create conflict? Maybe they're answering that question as well. And even maybe a more insightful question is, to what extent does globalization unlock the confrontational nature of people? So what is globalization? It's the interconnectedness of people, right? When we connect, does it unlock our confrontational nature? This one is saying that it has unlocked the confrontational nature of Americans. This one is saying that we could choose to compromise. This one is saying, how do we look at it? Sarcastically, they're saying it does unlock the confrontational nature as we have been erasing cultures. But they're saying maybe that's not a bad thing. Maybe confrontation has a purpose. So, step one, relationship paragraph, you need to discover a common question that holds them together as a set. And the common question should be somewhat unique to the set. Here in grade 10, in social studies 10, it's always going to be connected to globalization. You could use a common question like, to what extent is globalization a positive force? That's probably a common question that they're all going to deal with this year. In grade 12, most of the sources as a set will deal with the idea of, to what extent, should either the government control the people or the people control the government. Some kind of relationship between the people and the government question. But it is better for you to look at the specific details within the sources and try to pull out some kind of, common detail or common language that they're all struggling with. So that's where in my notes that are up here in the relationship part, we're doing step one, identify a common theme, a concept that the sources share. To what extent is imperialism justifiable, beneficial, unethical, that sort of thing. But what we're also doing to find step one is we're considering some of this. Some of, step three. Maybe we're looking at common rocks among the sources. So maybe all three of them are dealing with this idea of cultural homogenization. So step one, ladies and gentlemen, announce a common question. Taken as a set, each of the sources presents a perspective in response to what extent does globalization unlock the confrontational nature of people? That's step one. You do that every time that you do a relationship paragraph. Although the question might be different, the procedure is the same. Any questions about step one? Step two, logically, once you've said, here's the question that holds them together, step two, you might spend some time to say, with regards to this question, this is what they would answer. That's a logical next step. You said this is the question that holds them together as a set. Logically, the next step would be to say, with regards to this question, John Tomlinson, the voice behind source 1, would say this. The cartoonist that illustrated source 2 would say this. And the people that organized source 3 from progressiveview.org, they would respond to the question by stating this. That's a logical next step. Step 1, here's the question. Step 2, this is how each one answers the question. And again, as you can see by the guide that's on the board, a guide that I shared out with you last week, I do have a Prezi that shows exemplars of this as well. Generally described as a to what extent phrase. To what extent does globalization, in this case, unlock the confrontational nature of people? Confrontational. Step 2, maybe answer that question. With regards to this question, John Tomlinson, the voice behind source 1, would, if you take the source sarcastically, would argue that the confrontational nature may be a positive thing because he supports globalism. Or if you ignore the sarcasm that may be implied there and take it literally, then you'd argue that John Tomlinson's pointing out how confrontation leads to the eradication of cultures, and therefore confrontational nature of mankind needs to be limited, and we need to be cautious when we globalize. Then, with regards to this question, the people behind source 3, progressiveview.org, would suggest that although globalization does create an opportunity for confrontation, we must approach globalization looking for compromise, and therefore globalization will work. So step 2, long time in making this work. Step 2 is to answer the question we announced in step 1. Any questions about step 2? All right, let's go to step 3. Step 3, now that you've said here's a common question, step 2, this is how each one would answer. Step 3, please do step 3. A lot of students miss step 3. Step 3 here, have them react to each other's responses, because it's a relationship among the sources. By just saying here's a question that they all answer and here's how each one separately answers it, you only have one tie that binds them together here. It's a common question. This is how they answer it, but now you don't have them react to each other. I want you to have them react to each other. So in response to, John Tomlinson's answer, what would the people at progressiveview.org say? In response to John's answer, what would the cartoonist say? So this is where you look for details within each source where someone might say, you know what, this is what I agree with what you're saying, but I might disagree with what you're doing here. Look for parts of their source that they might agree with some, disagree with other points. They may disagree with their entire perspective. Maybe the two perspectives are polar opposites of each other. If given an opportunity to respond to the cartoonist from source 2, John Tomlinson would point out these flaws of logic, or this bias, or these assumptions that are incorrect, these limitations. Use that language. If given an opportunity to respond to progressiveview.org, John Tomlinson, the voice behind source 1, would point out these assumptions, these false assumptions, these biases, these limitations of logic. You might have sentences that say, although, John and the voice behind source 3 agree that globalization can be beneficial, this is where they disagree. They would disagree over something else, another point. So the point behind step 3 is to try to really, as specifically as possible, differentiate between the perspectives shown here. Where's the point where they begin to diverge, right? Where is the point where they begin to disagree with each other? Try to establish that point by looking at the details on the page and say, this is what they might agree about, this is what they might disagree about. And again, there might be two sources that completely disagree with each other. Any questions about step 3? Have them react, respond to each other. What would they be offended about? How would they counter it? Put them into a hypothetical debate. How would, John counter the assumptions of the cartoonist? How would John, counter the assumptions, counter-argue the assumptions made by the progressiveu.org? Now, some people might stop there. But I think that there's other relationships we can look for. Again, when I'm looking for other relationships, I might look for things like, were they all inspired by the same moment in history? Is there an allusion to an historical event that they're all making? Or are they all inspired by the same concept, like cultural homogenization? And did I mention that? So is there a detail that I haven't mentioned yet that is common to all 3 sources? Or perhaps common to 2 of the sources? Maybe there's a common detail in 2. Maybe 2 of the sources talk about a flood, but the 3rd one doesn't. Although source 2 ignores the concept of a flood, maybe source 1 and 3 both use a flood as an illustration of the damaging nature of globalization. That's not the case here, but it could be the case in a set that you see. So look for some kind of common detail, some common language that holds them together as either still a set of 3 or maybe 2 of them together. Another step that you can do in this relationship building is think about cause and effect. Cause and effect could also be described as chronological. Perhaps the sentiment in 1, if followed, will lead to the problem shown in 2 and can only be resolved by the solution in another one. Cause and effect. That the problem shown or the solution shown in 1 may create a new problem that is shown in 2, solved by the problem in 3. So for example, within this set, you could make the argument that the agitated nature of the Americans will lead to acts of violence and aggression that will ultimately lead to cultural destruction shown in 1. So the nature attributed to the Americans in source 2 may lead to the cultural violence and destruction alluded to in 1 and can only be resolved if Americans seek compromise that is offered as a solution in 3. That's a chronological, a linear relationship. This leads to that, leads to that. And there should be many opportunities to explore that as well. In summary, the last paragraph of this assignment, I would argue the most important one, is the relationship paragraph. It's out of 6 marks, that's 30% of the assignment. Start the paragraph by announcing a common question or theme that holds them together as a set. Taken together, taken as a set, each of the sources presents a response, an ideological perspective, a solution, something like that, to the common question or theme. To what extent? And the rest of that sentence will change depending upon the set. In this case, maybe, to what extent does globalization unlock the confrontational nature of people? Second part of the assignment, explore the actual answers that each source would give. With regards to this question, John Tomlinson would do this. With regards to this question, the cartoonist behind source 2 would do that. And finally, with regards to this question, what would the people behind that website say? Then have them react to each other's responses. What would they say? You know what? You're right about this, but this is where we disagree. Explore that third step so that you can differentiate. You can show where their ideological perspectives diverge. That they may have something that, they have some convergent thinking. They agree on something. Maybe they disagree about something else. Although they agree that globalization is an opportunity for cultures to be homogenized, they disagree on whether or not that's a positive opportunity or a negative thing, right? Look for language, look for details. We also had this cause and effect chronological relationship we can look for. I'm going to stop recording. I don't know if I'll ever post this because of the 27-minute break in the middle there. But what I'd ask you to do next is I've shared out 3 student samples. Read through their relationships now. See what the PF does more than the S. How is the PF more than the S? What have they done that the S didn't do? And then read the E and see how is the E done more than the PF. After you do that, we still have 12 minutes left in class. After you do that, begin to prepare your relationship paragraph. What are the steps that you're going to do in your paragraph due on Thursday, same set of sources, that is going to get you to that E or above level? And that's it for class today. I'm also going to walk around and see if you have any questions.